The one common thread that ran across all of them was you are going to regret that you took longer than you should have in making some decisions. So I thought, okay, if I'm hearing this from everyone, then I'm going to avoid that. And I didn't avoid it. So if the data clashes with the obvious, go with the obvious and try to figure out what's happening with the data. Focus on your customers, observe your competitors.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Fintech Leaders, coming to you from New York City. I'm your host, Miguel Armaza. I'm a co-founder of Gilgamesh Ventures, a venture capital fund that backs early-stage fintech entrepreneurs. If you enjoyed this conversation, I invite you to leave a review on Apple or Spotify so more people can learn about fintech leaders. In this episode, I sit down with Pedro Arnt, CEO of dLocal, a multi-billion-dollar payments company that specializes in cross-border and local payments in emerging markets. Founded in Montevideo, Uruguay, dLocal today operates in over 40 markets across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Pedro has an impressive background, and you will learn a lot from him. Prior to his appointment as dLocal CEO, he spent 24 years at MELI and was the CFO of the company from 2011 to 2023. During his tenure as CFO, MELI had an amazing run and went from a market cap of $4 billion to $70 billion. Today, MELI has a market cap of over $100 billion. In this episode, we discussed lessons from the early days of MELI and launching Mercado Pago, stepping into the role of CEO as a non-founder and avoiding manager mode, how to build beautiful products, expanding globally, how to hire amazing people, and a lot more. Pedro, welcome to Fintech Leaders all the way from Montevideo, Uruguay. Is that right?
That's right. Thank you for having me.
Pedro, I want to start right off the bat with one of your early experiences in entrepreneurship. And I understand you started an art marketplace in the late 90s maybe in Argentina. So this is not your first time leading a company. Maybe tell us, why did you do it and why didn't it work?
Yeah. So I think it's a great example of why I think to be a good founder, there's a combination of the right amount of strategic vision, theoretical business understanding, but also just practicality that comes many times with having done it over the years. Now that I'm an old man, I highlight the value of experience. So we had a brilliant thesis from an academic perspective, right? I was leaving BCG. I had seen the power of the internet. We were looking for markets that were inefficient, interesting, expandable TAMs, products that were somehow high margin enough that they made sense for very early stages of e-commerce. We had built a team that had the right connections. And so from a theoretical perspective, it made perfect sense, right? The internet back then was all about injecting efficiency where inefficiencies existed. And if I can, till this day, think of a market that is incredibly inefficient, that almost has opacity and is inefficiency as its central tenet to pricing, it's the art market. And we thought that there was enormous pent-up demand. So another central tenet of the theoretical internet thesis, which was people wanted to have art. People didn't want to have shitty paper posters. They just couldn't gain access to it. And when they could, the experience of buying was horrendous because there was so much opacity around price and quality. So it fit all the bills. It was the perfect checklist for this is the kind of things that the internet is here to solve. The pent-up demand exists, the distribution problems, it has the right ticket level, it has significant inefficiencies. And it's an interesting one because for many years I thought it was simply a matter of we were on the bleeding edge, not the leading edge, and that the theoretical reasons why an art marketplace should work would eventually materialize. I think till this day, it kind of hasn't. And so I think that's just a very interesting thing about that corner of the inefficient world, that I think the inefficiency is actually, it's the bug that's built into the experience. That's part of why art is so amazing to buy, potentially, is because it is opaque and it's unique and it's about this strange discovery and the experience. If you could access any artist from an incredibly infinite catalog of art pieces with almost perfectly priced quality and value dynamics, maybe buying art would be much less of a rush than it is for those that buy. So that one, I don't know if it'll ever happen, but that's the story of how we ended up there. It was a short-lived experience. And like everything in life, sometimes luck works in your advantage, because the fact that was a phenomenal example of fail fast is what generated the confluence of my timing of being, they're figuring out what next, having understood the power of the internet and having had blind conviction in its transformative power, but not knowing what to do. And my friends from MELI were starting up and looking for people to join the team. So it kind of worked out in my advantage.
I know you joined MELI basically 3 months after it was founded. I suspect at this point it was a pre-product market fit company. Right? Would you maybe share a bit of the environment in the very small office, I'm sure at that point at MELI back then?
Yeah. So the offices were the now famous garage that was there. I think the way I normally tell the story is I arrived at the building and I said, oh, wow, this building actually looks pretty good. Then I got in the elevator. We didn't go up. We went down. And I thought, that's interesting. And then we walked into a garage and it was the plaster boards that we had, like 4 or 5 literally parking spaces that we had drywalled. And that's where Marcos had started the company. There was no product market fit per se because the internet adoption was still very low. I do think he was very deliberate and very intelligent about having looked at the models that had worked internationally and that structurally made sense for Latin America. And so we didn't have product market fit in the markets where we were trying to build it out, but there was the famous comp validation. If you looked at eBay in the US, Amazon back then, I think, was the more questioned version of the business model because it was still about marketplaces, but it had that combination of a validating comp in the developed world.
So today, I'm looking at the market cap today of MELI, $107 billion, which is quite amazing, going from zero. Were there times where Marcos, Galperin, you, the team, considered that, hey, we're going to have to pack up and go? We're going to have to shut down if this happens, maybe very soon. Like, how many of those times did you go through?
Yeah. So Marcos tells a story. I think there's one obvious critical moment where prior to the Series A, which I think was a $12 million Series A. No, it's prior to the Series B. So now we're in the early 2000. And he always tells a story where it's sort of those contrasting moments of early stage entrepreneurship, where he had been invited to give this talk in front of a whole bunch of people as one of the potentially most successful of the startups that were emerging at that time. Argentina was amazing in that first cycle of the internet because it really was the ecosystem where the most thing happened. If you think of many of the first wave of successful internet companies or even ISPs, they really were coming out of Buenos Aires. And Mercado Libre looked like had the potential to be yet another one or one of those. And so he goes and he has to go give this chat, but he knows inside that he's literally weeks away from either closing a round or running out of funds. And so he says how he locks himself in the stall of the bathroom. And it's basically one of those moments where you have to just inhale really deep and say, I haven't fallen over the cliff yet. There's still run room. And let's just go do what we need to do and things will work out, right? And so he gathers his composure. He goes out. He gives the speech. That's very Marcos, I think, right? He's incredibly gritty and perseverant. And he's always had this really interesting, I think, for a leader, inherent optimism. Like he's incredibly grounded and pragmatic and realist, but at the core, he's an optimist. And that's a really interesting, I think, combination if you're starting a company, because if you don't have that optimism, so many things can go wrong and will go wrong that if you overthink your chances of success, you probably shy away or you don't really execute with the kind of all-in-ness that's required. And the rest is history. It worked out quite well.
I'm curious, how was it internally? How were the conversations? How transparent was it that those were the two possible paths?
In terms of the team that they had put together that reported into them, very open. It was always, I think, a clear part of the way that company culture was built was through a lot of honesty, brutal honesty, a lot of transparency throughout. Also understanding that there's a difference between keeping you informed and appraised and also need to know basis. So we were always very efficient. And that was always, I think, a two-way street with the leadership team. I always knew that I would have been told of where we were and what was going on, but that many instances I needed to keep doing my job, whatever it was. And so there was a certain amount of inquisitiveness that we understood was fair game, but then no need to get into the details because you're going to lose focus and you're not adding as much value in the negotiation or in this conversation as if you keep running the business we need to run. And I think we all as a leadership team did a really good job at that. Everyone, it's always one of the most amazing things about that team. And I think until this day, still looking at them operate, everyone really understands the role they have within that dynamic and functions really well within those sort of almost unwritten rules of it's a team, we're all informed, but then we also all need to know what it is that we need to focus on.
Let's talk a bit about the fintech arm of MELI, Mercado Pago. Why launch it in the first place? I understand you were involved in kind of part of the decision making. Why launch it? What was the vision then? Did you guys envision it becoming what it is today, which is essentially one of the largest fintechs in LATAM, if you were to extrapolate just the fintech arm?
Yeah. So Marcos says that he had it written in the business plan from the very first day, which is in part true because he had looked, I said at first how they had looked at models that had a certain validation outside. And online finance or online banking was one of the models that had attracted him. Wenceslao had already launched Patagon, and there was something about where eBay was back then that made more sense. But so that was always something that he had clear in his mind. That's part one. Part two is it was a really good example of allowing your product roadmap and your strategy to be defined by the obvious customer pain points. And so the genesis of Mercado Pago is actually an escrow system. And it existed because simply using what back then was the feedback system, so all the information on a seller's previous transactions within the context of Latin America wasn't exactly enough to get over the trust hump, right? We're talking still early noughts. And so you had to somehow solve the issue of who makes the first move. Is it the seller by shipping the product, or is it the buyer by sending the funds? And so Mercado Libre, with this product called Mercado Pago, actually inserted itself in the middle and simply said, this is an escrow, right? So sellers send me the money, it's in escrow with me, and then we get the ball rolling. And it was a direct reaction to how we solved for the trust issue. Now, I think very quickly you began to realize, and PayPal did exist and was part of eBay, that there's clearly something much, much larger going on here. And in a way, I think Pago is the first example for what to me eventually became one of the many reasons why MELI is the most valuable company in Latin America, which was this keen understanding that was developed that you had this distribution platform which allowed you to distribute new business models to your existing customer base. But on top of that, combined with the enormous focus on product and technology that culture always had, it allowed you to experiment and to iterate and to actually go to market very early with an MVP in a less competed environment, because not everyone can offer their services on the marketplace. And so that allowed you not just the distribution, which is what everyone always talks about, but also the iterative process of going to market and of finding product market fit in a somewhat protected environment competitively, where you weren't competing with others and you weren't burning the user experience either. And so that process of gaining scale within the marketplace to then take it to a broader audience, I think is a big part of what Mercado Libre eventually has become over and over again. If you look at how many successful verticals they have launched and probably will launch going forward.
You mentioned the process of iterating. In general, over your career, what have you learned about the right approach to launch a product and iterate and bring the feedback and implement it into product and launch it again?
It's actually, I'm not a product guy, right? But I've been around them. I think it's a simple process. The difficult thing is to just set it up right? You have to have the right feedback loops in place to make sure that you're getting that information back from what's happening in an accurate fashion that's actually true. You also have to be careful that you're not getting confused or blinded by the noise that comes with data. I've seen this so many times. And actually, MELI's current COO and longtime CTO, Danny, was always very good about that. Like, he understood the power of the heuristics in terms of figuring out what it is that you need to build in a product. And then that was complemented with data that was coming from the iterations. But it was never in the MELI build out purely driven by the data, because there is so much noise in the data that is very difficult to parse out. So I think that was always one key learning, which is don't underestimate the power of the heuristics and the intuition. Use the data, but use it with a very acute sense of how it can confuse you. And so if the data clashes with the obvious, go with the obvious and try to figure out what's happening with the data. Build those right loops, right? And remember and allow your teams to build understanding that there will be many errors along the way. And that what's most important is to, from each error, adapt quickly, change quickly, and move forward quickly, but make sure that the direction of travel is the right one, right? There's a very common, I think you'll see a lot of people from that company answer the question, what are some of the mistakes you made along the way? And the answer basically is everything. Like, the company was built on top of an infinite number of mistakes. And that's exactly why it's such an amazing product, because the mistake was building into the design. The mistake was how you knew how to course correct rather than trying to figure it out yourselves.
You have to make those mistakes. Yeah. Pedro, let's switch gears and talk a bit about dLocal. At MELI, your last role was CFO, yet you had other roles before that. Which one of those roles becomes the most relevant today in your role as CEO of dLocal?
Yeah. Look, I think one of the things that I was incredibly fortunate was that one of the things that I felt that I was allowed to have a lot of say in and lead in many aspects in MELI was as we were scaling up in many aspects. I was a little bit of and the CFO role helped for that because the title kind of helps. But I was really one of the people that spent the most time thinking about company building, right? So not just the business itself or the results, but what are the mechanisms? What are the processes? What are the things that you need to lay in place for this to be able to scale? And it was a super gratifying work because it's, I think, what I like the most to do. But it was also super gratifying in MELI because if there was one thing, or one of the many things, but one thing that was always central to that story was, does it scale? Will it scale? And it was very easy, even when you were building things out in the very initial iterations, to avoid, it's funny, it's almost like the contrary to the Y Combinator axiom, right? Do things that don't scale. And I'm all for that. I get it. But there was also a very strong consciousness that, does this scale? Are you building something that once you're successful, because we always assumed we were going to be successful, will it scale well? And so within that context, culturally, it was really great to be able to think through, okay, what are the mechanisms? What are the processes? How does this need to look so that it can go not just from 0 to 10, but then from 10 to 1,000? And those things are very different. So what I think is amazing about dLocal, and that's why to me this was such an obvious challenge that it's been a year now and I'm incredibly happy and still enthused with every morning when I get up, is it's this amazing market opportunity of essentially helping global companies solve for payments in emerging markets. Super healthy P&L, right? High margin, high growth, high cash generation. And yet the founders were so phenomenally successful because the necessity and the TAM is there, that in 7 years, the company went from founding all the way through publicly traded company in over 40 markets. And so at the pace that we intend to continue going, there is still so much of maturation that needs to occur. Because again, most companies year 7 are still private in a few markets. Some are still testing product market fit. This has been an absolute rocket ship. And so now there's a period here where, as you continue to move along at this pace, you also need to make sure that you're inserting all of these mechanisms, these ways of working. I like to think of it as the operating system of the company, so that if you continue to compound growth the way that we ambition to continue compounding, it all works, right? And again, it's 40 plus markets. So it's a very complex beast. So I think a lot of what I learned the first time around, from what worked well, from what didn't work well, it is really helping me navigate what it is that we need to build at dLocal today.
What were your goals coming in fresh? I was just talking to a CEO, similar size company, who came in and he had some clear goals for the first 100 days, right? Did you have something like that first 6 months, first year? How did you think about, your initial period at the company?
Yeah. So I thought a lot about this, and there will be an honest piece of I don't even know if it's advice, but I'll tell a story around this, right? So 2 things. I think you need to have that famous 100-day plan or 90-day plan. Inevitably, in a lot of those 90 days, even if you don't want it to be, unless you come from the industry or you come from the company, are going to be about setting in motion the obvious tasks you need to do. And a lot of those are really more about your onboarding process or your reach. So reach out to customers, reach out to stakeholders, talk to the regulator, build this team, build this other team. But it's really, there's no massive strategic decision or anything going on. And dLocal didn't really need that. I think there was a very clear strategy. There's very clear go-to-market fit. So I think those plans are necessary for anyone transitioning into a CEO role, but I wouldn't overstate the ambition in those first 100 days. And here's the anecdote. So before I took the job, I talked to a few people who had stepped into the CEO role in founder-led companies, which is even more difficult, right? Because when you're the next wave of transition from one professional CEO to the other, it's just a succession. When you're getting handed things over from the founders, it's super challenging for many reasons. I think most importantly among them is you have to realize that there are things that founders can do and can operate that you will not be able to, right? I was hearing the whole debate a few weeks ago around Brian Chesky from Airbnb and his whole talk that no one was there, but everyone's now read about it around the professionals told me to do this. It fucked up the company. So I reflected a lot of that because I said, wait a minute, am I the guy he's talking about? And I said, no, wait a minute. I don't think so. I think I've been through founding of companies. I was side by side with Marcos for many years, and I'm acutely aware of what to do and what not to do. But part of, I think, my reaction to what Chesky was saying was, there is a roadmap when you're inheriting someone's company than when you're him or you're Seva and it was your company. You don't try to emulate, because if you try to emulate, there are things that only a founder can do because of the understanding he has of the company, because of the dynamics he has with everyone at the company. And so I was really keen to understand. So I talked to like 3 or 4 people who had been through that process, and I got a lot of different advice, all of which was useful. The one common thread that ran across all of them was, you are going to regret that you took longer than you should have in making some decisions. So I thought, okay, if I'm hearing this from everyone, then I'm going to avoid that. And I didn't avoid it. I look back now and I say, there's a lot of stuff that my intuition told me 2 months into the business that I've held back a year, and because I wasn't sure. And now I look back and it was exactly what I thought 2 months in. But I think there's also a reason why you do that, is when you start moving things somewhat more assertively, you really need to make sure that you're all in. And I realized that when I was talking to another CEO who inherited a company from a founder, and we were kind of going through this, and I was saying, this concerns me. And he looked at me and he said, the one thing that's concerning me as I hear you is you need to have tremendous conviction in that entire change program that you're pushing. Because if you're not fully convinced, then it's going to be difficult. People will smell the doubt, and change is always difficult. And that's when it clicked for me. I said, okay, so it wasn't about whether I knew all this 2 months into the job. It was more about, after a year on the job, I have tremendous conviction that this is where we need to go. So when you have naysayers, when you have doubts, when things don't work, because lots of times you're doing the right thing and short term it's not working, at least my conviction level is very high to say, I really know this is the direction. And so we're going to keep going.
Yeah. And then that gets exacerbated as a public company with quarterly calls and all that.
Absolutely. Doing all that under the eye of public markets requires, again, a high level of conviction and long-term thinking.
As you think about the mid to long-term future of dLocal, but you're planning today, how important is it to stay focused on your customers, but also on your competitors?
Yeah. I think I like the phrase, I don't know if I'm stealing this from someone or if it's just something we've developed over the years, which is focus on your customers, observe your competitors. And that's something that I think certainly something we've always done. I've always done in the different places I've been at, which is you spend a lot of time really understanding what others are doing, because you learn a lot from that. You learn what to potentially copy. You learn what to react to. You need to know how they are going to market, because that's what your customer is being offered. But make sure that the decision you're making them based on what's right for your customer. So don't fall into the short-term trap of competitive reactions to something that a competitor did that isn't right for your merchant. Don't follow after a feature, or don't do things that don't make sense long-term for your consumer, because it might really hurt your competitors short-term, right? Avoid those, because I think that's where energy goes in the wrong direction. If you know that it's a killer blow, then maybe you do something like that, but rarely do you really face those situations in business. But I think there's an enormous amount of learning that goes from staying very in tune with what your competitors are doing, and maybe even more importantly, what global peers are doing. That was always super important to us as well.
Speaking of global peers, I mean, you mentioned operating in 40 countries. It's certainly one of the few Latin American companies doing that. I mean, I know that David at Nubank is talking about going beyond LATAM. I know others are, maybe not so publicly, but privately. But the reality is it hasn't happened so much. Any thoughts on why that is?
Yeah, I think there's an analogy in what the way dLocal approaches it, just to be super fair, right? We get asked the question, when are you going to attack the global north? So when are you going to offer your services in Europe or North America? And we say, nope, it's not in the plans, right? Global South is our pond. It's where we differentiate. It's where the way we build product, the way we service merchants, and the reason why we exist, the fragmentation, the complexity, the legacy systems of the fintech environment, and therefore everything we've done as a consequence of that, is very applicable to the global South. It's not applicable in developed markets. If I were to go offer dLocal's key success factors in developed markets, they don't translate well. What translates well there are the key success factors behind a Stripe or behind an Adyen. Now, the counter to that is that, and I've said this over and over again, I don't think their key success factors translate well to our neck of the woods. Like if you're going to go to Costa Rica or to Ghana or to the Philippines to try to build a fully integrated acquirer where you own every single line of code, it doesn't port well and it doesn't scale well if you need to cover 40 plus markets. But so for us, it's having an acute understanding of where not just our product and service, but the way we run the company generates competitive advantages. And that's the global South. I think for many Latin American companies, there's an analogy there, which is this is the part of the world that I really understand well, that I've built the capabilities, and that the way I've tropicalized my model, or the way I built my model from zero applies. If I go beyond LATAM, that competitive mode, those key success factors, they get blunted. And so the capital allocation is probably not the right one. Okay. So I think that's what it's been. Now, there is something to be said, and I admire the founders of dLocal enormously, because it's one thing to see that conceptually. It's another thing to then go and do it in Africa. And that's something that I think Seba was really good about always, which was he always said, you don't really know the answer to the problem. So you think it through, but you need to keep the right amount of self-doubt, because that's what pushes you to try. And so Africa, although now the way I've explained it has the same kind of fragmentation and systems in fintech that's very similar to LATAM, so it made sense conceptually, but then you had to have the guts to go and try to build something in Africa, which very few Latin American companies have done. Like once you proved yourself there, the Middle East, Asia, those become more obvious expansions, because it's almost as if you've tested that thesis that the similarities across the global South are enough. So it's a combination, I think, of making sure that your key success factors port well, and then having the guts to say, let's go and try. We can always pull back if it's not working. And that just doesn't happen enough.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's talk a bit about kind of building a team. I know, and that's obviously something you're doing now. I'm sure you're strengthening the team, you're building maybe some new divisions. So just adding your signature to the company. I've heard that you're a big fan of doing reference calls before you bring someone on board. how do you complete a great reference call? It's not just about calling someone like, hey, is this a good person? Yeah, it goes
No,
beyond that.
but here it's interesting. So first of all, I asked myself many times. First of all, the genesis was that I realized that at one point when I was hiring my teams, I was literally asking people to spend 4 or 5 interview sessions with me. And because before that, I simply said, I just don't know enough about this person to pull the trigger. Like we had one structured interview. I asked the structured questions. I can compare it to the other 3 people I spent 50 minutes with because the first 10 were sort of breaking the ice. And this is the shittiest way I can think of making such a relevant decision. So there's got to be a better way to do that. And so I went to the literature. Actually, a lot of the literature I found was pretty taxative, that the worst is a non-structured interview process. That'll get you nothing. A structured interview process is a little bit less of a crapshoot. Work samples are apparently a little bit less of a crapshoot than a structured interview. And remarkably, when you ran the regressions, what other people that had spent years working with these people you're about to hire had to say about them is by far the least bad predictive element. And then when I read that, I said, this is so obvious. I mean, it's evident if you work it back. The issue with reference checks is A, they can be a little bit cumbersome, but most importantly, and especially in Latin America, they're almost done as this check. The guy isn't psychotic. But and even more so, I think in LATAM, there's this understanding that when you get called upon to give a reference check, the last thing you want to do is complicate the poor person who's about to get a job, because it's considered to be the last piece of a process where he's practically hired. And so it's not so much about the great questions I ask, it's how do I set the stage very early on that I'm able to try to break that barrier of I'm just going to sort of get out of this in 10 minutes without sinking the person, right? So it's just saying, look, I really need very honest feedback. This is in the strictest of confidence. It's making sure you're not just going to the people they gave you. It's to find the right sample set. And then most importantly, it's making sure you ask, what are the strengths? There you do a structured interview almost. What are the weaknesses, right? And what issues did you have with this person? But if you can get the person to basically think, okay, he really wants an honest take, and I'm going to give it to him and I'm not going to feel guilty about it, then you've accomplished that. And again, just think about it, going back to the beginning. It's so obvious that someone who's worked with someone over a 3 or 5 year period will have pretty much all the insights you need to determine whether it's the right person or not.
It's a little bit similar in venture capital. You get to know the person, the pitch is the interview, the work sample is maybe the demo or the MVP, and then you absolutely need to do those reference checks, and they're hard. Very interesting. Pedro, before we run out of time, how do you come up with ideas? I'm curious.
Yeah, it's a challenge because the day-to-day can really take over, right? One of the things I've learned in this new job is you could work 24 hours a day and you're still not going to get through the agenda of things you wanted to get through. So finding the time to actually take a step back, stop and think is super important. I'm stating the obvious here, but the difficult piece is how do you accomplish that? And I don't think I'm doing a good job here. The other day, someone was telling me about a very successful entrepreneur. This was some time back, who would literally, I don't know if this was true or not, but it seemed like a true example, would hop on a flight from the East Coast to Hawaii. He'd land and he'd turn back and go the other way. Oh, and really, it was a ritual that he had established to be completely disconnected because he didn't have Wi-Fi on board. So that would give him this built-in time that he would adjust. So that kind of thing, I think, is important, is make sure, and that's just an example. I'm not saying do that's for a highly regimented mind who probably enjoys airplanes, but really being able to find the time, blocking out the agenda to think is really important. That's one. And then on a personal aspect for me, and this is kind of counterproductive, it's inefficient, but it is how I work, is I'm someone who really needs to brainstorm with others. That's why also for me, making sure that my team is a good balance of hyper efficient people who maybe have a learning process that's more individual and less collective is important, because I tend to be very much driven by conversations, and brainstorming conversations by definition can be very non-productive, especially if you come from a startup mindset where if something doesn't immediately have an action plan and an execution corollary, then it's kind of useless, as we're all taught. Brainstorming is different. Brainstorming, you almost don't want to have too clear of an action plan because you're still maturing the ideas. And I really need that with others. So I try to make sure that my teams have a combination of people that actually can do that with me without hating me, and identifying the ones that's just not their thought process and not really putting them through that kind of torture. And when I'm doing it with them, making sure it's a lot shorter. So that's usually the combination for me, is finding the alone time for the idea to germinate. And then I need that back and forth with 2-3 other people. I just need to be disciplined to say, okay, I've already stolen an hour, or let them know it's a brainstorming session beforehand to set the expectations, and then say, okay, enough. I could go on for another 3 hours because this is the way I learn, but we're going to cut here.
But you bring so much experience and knowledge from your years of experience. Who do you like to learn from when it comes to books? Any books you recommend often, or are books are an escape for you and you're just reading fiction?
Yeah, so that's a good point. Increasingly, almost not even as an escape because of just time constraints and stuff. But when I do read, it is much more about, this is the moment where I really go elsewhere, right? It's either that or brain dead watching sports on television. And there's another thing that's happened to me, which is, maybe this is an unfair comment, but I have this general sense that the business editing industry is about grabbing incredibly powerful business ideas, but that you can summarize in 10, 15 pages or in a 10-minute video, and then turning that into 300 pages so that it's sellable and publishable. So I have a really hard time getting through business books. I learn a lot from going to summary, to conferences that the authors give, people who talk about the books. And so a lot of my more academic consumption, which I do try to learn a lot from theory, I really like what comes out of business schools. I end up looking for things like case studies, Harvard Business Review, short form articles where really everything you need from that idea is there. And there's plenty of magazines and infinite amount of summaries on the web for almost anything that you're looking to learn from, right? And it's just a matter of understanding who the well-reputable sources are, or professors that are thought leaders, and seeing who they're citing or who they're talking about. And then fiction is a bit of an escape. The one I'm currently reading has actually been much more of a pleasure than I thought it would be. And it's going to be really off the wall, but I'll tell you what it is anyway. It's called The Umbrella Murder, and it's not fiction. It's a 30+ year investigative piece on a murder that happened on Waterloo Bridge in London in 1978 of a Bulgarian expat. And what caught me wasn't so much the story, but it was the fact that literally it was 40 years of investigation, and the book was printed in 2023. And so I thought, what could have happened more recently that leads him to believe that now's the time to finally print, when he started investigating this back in the early 90s. And it's been a complete page turner. I'm not through it yet, but it's worth the read, and it's a fairly quick read.
I love that story. If you enjoy that book, you probably enjoy this podcast called Wind of Change about the song. I won't spoil anything, but it's on Spotify. Amazing 4 or 5 part series. But Pedro, thank you so much. I know we're way over time. Thank you for taking this valuable time to share your story, share your learnings. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's been fun. Stay in touch.
Thanks for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this great episode with Pedro, CEO of dLocal. If you want more interviews, make sure to subscribe, follow, and leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your shows. It helps and means a lot. And if you have any suggestions or thoughts about the show, just drop me a line on Twitter or LinkedIn. Signing off, till next week, I'm your host, Miguel Armaza. The Fintech Leaders podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered financial or investment advice.